Representative Jasmine Crockett stood at the congressional hearing podium, her sharp red blazer standing out against the dark wooden backdrop of the chamber. Moments earlier, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh had delivered what many believed to be an unshakable defense of his controversial ruling. The room had gone quiet, reporters scribbling rapidly, thinking the debate had ended. But Crockett, microphone in hand and focus unbroken, wasn't done yet. What followed left the entire chamber silent. In less than 30 seconds, she dismantled Kavanaugh's argument so precisely that even some Republican senators looked visibly taken aback. This wasn't just a counterpoint, it was the moment Crockett transformed a complex legal discussion into a national headline, reshaping public perception of the Supreme Court. Before we dive deeper into how it unfolded, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more insightful political breakdowns and major updates from Washington. The hearing resumed. Under heavy tension as Justice Brett Kavanaugh adjusted his papers at the witness table. Appointed to the Supreme Court in 2018, Kavanaugh had recently authored a ruling that reignited a nationwide debate. His decision, which narrowed voting rights protections, was praised by conservatives as a model of constitutional originalism, but criticized by progressives as an act of judicial overreach. With his Georgetown and Yale background, Kavanaugh projected confidence. Having survived his turbulent confirmation process, he viewed his lifetime appointment as insulation from political pressures. His testimony that morning was steady and unapologetic. The court cannot invent rights not explicitly outlined in the Constitution. Our duty is interpretation, not legislation. Across the chamber sat Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas. At 42, she was relatively new to Congress but had deep roots in civil rights law. Unlike many of her colleagues, she had represented real clients in voting rights cases, people directly impacted by rulings like Kavanaugh's. While other Democrats had relied on predictable talking points, Crockett had stayed quiet, observing Kavanaugh's tone and movements. Minutes before her turn, an aide handed her a folder, overnight research that hadn't appeared in any official briefing. As her 5-minute questioning slot was announced, several Republican members glanced at their phones, expecting another routine exchange. But Crockett's staff knew otherwise. She wasn't there to make headlines. She was there with Kavanaugh's own past words, ones that directly contradicted his recent decision. The stakes couldn't have been higher. With millions of Americans voting access on the line ahead of the next election, this was more than political theater. It was a defense of the democratic process itself. And Crockett was about to prove that sometimes 30 seconds is enough to expose a contradiction that can shift a national conversation. Chairman Johnson called the room back to order after a brief recess. The chair recognizes Representative Crockett for 5 minutes. Kavanaugh adjusted his tie slightly, having already faced 4 hours of questioning. He expected more of the same, familiar criticisms, easily deflected. Crockett stepped to the microphone, placing a slim folder neatly on the podium. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Justice Kavanaugh, I appreciate your presence today." Her tone was calm and deliberate, more measured than her usual fiery style. The subtle change caught the attention of reporters in the front row. "Justice Kavanaugh, in your majority opinion last month, you stated that implicit voting protections cannot be read into the Constitution unless the text specifically grants them. Is that an accurate summary of your view?" Kavanaugh nodded confidently. "Yes, Representative. The text of the Constitution must guide our interpretation, not modern preferences." Crockett didn't break eye contact. "And you also wrote that judicial restraint requires leaving any expansion of such rights to Congress. Is that correct?" "That's correct," he replied. "The separation of powers is a foundational principle." Several Republican members nodded approvingly, thinking this was another routine exchange. But Crockett wasn't finished. "So, Justice Kavanaugh," Crockett began evenly, "your judicial philosophy, as shown in this ruling, is that rights not clearly outlined in the Constitution cannot be created by the court. The text must be explicit and specific. Is that correct?" "That's an accurate description," Kavanaugh replied, his posture easing slightly. The chamber stayed quiet. Reporters watched closely, unsure where Crockett was heading with what seemed like routine confirmations. Then came the shift. Crockett opened a slim folder. Justice Kavanaugh, I'm holding a copy of a legal article you published in the Georgetown Law Journal in 2008, before you served on any federal court. Would you like to review it? A congressional aide handed the document to Kavanaugh. His brow furrowed as he recognized it immediately. In this article, Crockett continued, you wrote, and I quote, "Constitutional interpretation must evolve with the nation's understanding of liberty and equality. When the text is ambiguous, judges have not only the right but the duty to consider how fundamental principles apply to modern circumstances." A soft murmur rippled through the chamber. Kavanaugh's expression hardened. Crockett pressed forward. You also wrote that voting is the cornerstone of democracy, and that courts must interpret election laws with the goal of maximizing participation. Kavanaugh interrupted quickly. Representative, that article was addressing a theoretical framework, not— I'm not finished, Justice Kavanaugh, Crockett said firmly, her tone steady but unmistakably assertive. The room grew tense. You further wrote, she continued, that technical barriers to voting should be subject to strict judicial scrutiny, as they may impose unconstitutional burdens on fundamental rights. Those are your words, correct? The chamber fell completely silent. Kavanaugh's face reddened slightly. The context of that article was different from— Crockett didn't pause. Justice Kavanaugh, did you write those words? Yes, he admitted. So 15 years ago, Crockett said evenly, you argued that courts should interpret voting rights broadly to expand participation. Yet now, as a Supreme Court justice, you've ruled in the opposite direction. Across the room, Democratic members leaned forward. Several Republicans shifted uneasily in their seats. This was not the questioning they had anticipated. Kavanaugh attempted to recover. Representative, legal scholarship often explores multiple perspectives. My responsibility as a justice is— Crockett cut in once more, maintaining her calm but unwavering tone. Justice Kavanaugh, I'm not questioning academic theory. I'm questioning consistency. You spoke passionately about defending voting rights when seeking academic credibility, but limited those same rights once you held judicial power. So which Brett Kavanaugh should the American public believe? The scholar who championed democracy, or the justice who just restricted it? The camera zoomed in as Kavanaugh's jaw tightened, his silence speaking louder than any response. The chamber erupted with murmurs as tension filled the air. Chairman Johnson struck his gavel sharply. Order. The justice will be allowed to respond. Kavanaugh cleared his throat. Representative Crockett, my views have evolved over time, as any jurists should. The article you mentioned reflected my perspective as an academic, not as a— So you admit your position has completely changed? Crockett interjected. I wouldn't describe it that way, Kavanaugh replied, his usual composure slipping. Senator Graham leaned forward, whispering to a colleague as reporters' cameras clicked rapidly. Crockett continued, lifting another document from her folder. Justice Kavanaugh, are you familiar with the amicus brief you helped prepare in 1999 for the Washington Legal Foundation? Kavanaugh's expression shifted slightly. He hadn't expected this. In that brief, Crockett said, reading directly, you argued that voting rights deserve the highest level of constitutional protection, and that procedural barriers disproportionately affecting minority communities raise serious 14th Amendment concerns. She looked up. Yet your recent ruling rejects this exact standard. How do you reconcile these positions? The room grew stiller. This wasn't a single contradiction. It was a pattern. Democratic members exchanged knowing glances. Even some Republicans appeared uneasy. Kavanaugh attempted to recover. Representative, legal advocacy and judicial decision-making are two different roles. As an advocate, I represented client interests. As a justice. So your principles depend on who's paying you? Crockett asked evenly, her tone controlled yet pointed. A wave of gasps spread through the room. Chairman Johnson struck his gavel again. The representative will refrain from personal implications. Crockett nodded. Understood, Mr. Chairman. Let me rephrase. She turned back to Kavanaugh. Justice Kavanaugh, do you believe the American people deserve consistent application of legal principles, regardless of a judge's position or power? The question lingered. Every eye in the chamber turned toward the witness table. Of course, Kavanaugh answered cautiously. Consistency is important, but jurisprudence is complex. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Crockett interrupted, now addressing the cameras directly. I believe I've made my point. I yield back the remainder of my time. A heavy silence followed, 30 seconds that said more than words could. Kavanaugh sat rigidly, his prepared responses suddenly irrelevant. Committee members shuffled papers, avoiding eye contact. And in the press gallery, reporters were already typing furiously on their phones. What began as a routine oversight hearing had just turned into something far more significant. In under 5 minutes, with just 30 seconds of precise questioning, Representative Jasmine Crockett accomplished what hours of prior testimony had failed to do. She exposed a contradiction that even Justice Brett Kavanaugh couldn't easily defend. As the session adjourned, the hearing room doors opened and representatives spilled into the hallway. Reporters rushed forward, microphones in hand, eager to capture immediate reactions. What was meant to be a brief 10-minute recess had turned into a media storm. Inside the chamber, Crockett calmly organized her papers, her expression composed despite the noise. Across the room, Justice Kavanaugh leaned in close to his legal team, their hurried whispers revealing clear concern. Damage control was already underway. CNN's congressional correspondent managed to reach Crockett first. Representative, was that exchange planned or did it happen spontaneously? Crockett adjusted her red blazer before responding. I simply came prepared with Justice Kavanaugh's own words. The contradiction speaks for itself. Moments later, a Fox News reporter stepped forward. Congresswoman, critics are saying you ambushed Justice Kavanaugh unfairly. There's nothing unfair about holding public officials accountable to their own statements, Crockett replied evenly. The American people deserve consistency from their Supreme Court. Meanwhile, at the chairman's desk, Johnson was locked in a tense conversation with committee leaders from both parties. The day's agenda had completely unraveled. Several Republican members were now pushing for additional time, insisting that Kavanaugh be allowed to clarify the context of his earlier writings. Out in the corridor, Senator Elizabeth Warren approached Crockett, briefly shaking her hand. That was impressive, Jasmine, she said. His entire argument just fell apart. Crockett nodded modestly. Sometimes you don't need long speeches, she replied. You just need the facts. Behind them, phones began buzzing almost in unison as the first clip hit social media. Crockett's 30-second exchange, which Brett Kavanaugh should the American people believe, had already been viewed over 50,000 times within the first 3 minutes. The hashtag #CrockettReceipts was trending nationwide. At the witness table, Kavanaugh's aides hurriedly passed him notes. His usually calm judicial demeanor had cracked, revealing a man now on the defensive. When the hearing resumed, his responses became increasingly technical, filled with legal terminology, a familiar tactic to complicate what Crockett had made simple. As Kavanaugh tried to rebuild his argument, Representative Jim Jordan took the microphone. Justice Kavanaugh deserves the chance to clarify that academic writing differs from judicial opinions, he stated. Chairman Johnson quickly intervened. The justice has already been given time to respond. Kavanaugh leaned toward the mic. If I could clarify my position, he began, but the damage was already done. His attempt to justify his shifting views sounded unconvincing after Crockett's focused questioning. Even conservative commentators watching the live broadcast found it difficult to defend the contradiction. Within 30 minutes, the clip had spread well beyond political news outlets. Entertainment pages were sharing it, athletes were reposting it. The moment had moved past partisan lines and struck a deeper chord. The public's desire to see powerful figures held accountable to their own words. On MSNBC, the headline read, "Crockett checkmates Kavanaugh with his own words." Even on Fox News, analysts were split. While the questioning may have been sharp, one commentator admitted, The facts are hard to ignore. These are direct quotes from Justice Kavanaugh's previous writings. By the time the hearing ended 2 hours later, Crockett's exchange had surpassed 2 million views online. Law professors were assigning it as mandatory viewing, while constitutional scholars were publishing rapid response commentaries. The video had captured something rare in modern politics, a genuine moment of accountability. No shouting, no theatrics, just 30 seconds of precise questioning that exposed a contradiction so clear that even the most skilled legal arguments couldn't disguise it. As Representative Crockett exited the committee room, surrounded by staff and colleagues, her phone rang. It was the White House. The president had watched the exchange live and wanted to speak with her immediately. "Representative Crockett," the president said when she answered in a private room, "you just did more to explain the importance of our judicial system in 30 seconds than I've managed in 30 speeches." "Thank you, Mr. President," she replied calmly. "Sometimes the truth only needs the right question." Outside, a crowd had begun to gather spontaneously, holding handmade signs reading, "Crockett for Justice," and "Which Kavanaugh? Do you believe?" What had started as a routine oversight hearing had evolved into a cultural moment, a rare instance where political debate gave way to something authentic. Crockett hadn't merely won a political exchange. She had demonstrated why judicial consistency matters to ordinary Americans and their rights. As evening fell, the clips continued to circulate across platforms. Traditional news outlets struggled to keep up with the viral spread on social media. People who had never before engaged with judicial politics were watching, sharing, and commenting. Later that night, back in her office, Crockett received a handwritten note, quietly delivered by a clerk from the Supreme Court. The message inside was brief and deliberate. "Counselor, the questions deserved better answers than I gave today. B. Kavanaugh." Crockett placed the note neatly into her folder, neither proud nor surprised. This had never been about humiliating Justice Kavanaugh. It was about revealing a deeper truth, how power can often reshape principles. By nightfall, the 30-second clip had been viewed more than 10 million times. The top comment beneath it read simply, "This is what accountability looks like." As dawn broke over Washington, every major news network led with the same headline: "Crockett's questioning of Kavanaugh becomes most viewed congressional clip in history." The numbers were astonishing. The 30-second exchange had been viewed over 75 million times across platforms, translated into 28 languages, and had generated over 200,000 comments along with legal analysis from scholars around the world. Across coffee shops and breakfast tables nationwide, Americans who rarely discussed Supreme Court decisions were suddenly debating judicial consistency. Crockett's straightforward questioning had made complex constitutional issues understandable to the public. The core question now was clear. Do principles matter, regardless of position, or don't they? Morning shows rushed to secure interviews with Crockett, but her office issued a short statement. Representative Crockett believes Justice Kavanaugh's own words speak for themselves. She has nothing further to add at this time. That restraint only magnified her impact. Unlike politicians who might have sought the spotlight, Crockett's silence ensured the focus stayed on the substance of the exchange, not on personality or politics. Meanwhile, at the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh arrived through the underground garage to avoid hundreds of protesters who had gathered overnight. Signs lined the sidewalks reading, "Which Kavanaugh?" Law students from Georgetown, Howard, and American University held a silent reading of his previous writings, the very ones Crockett had quoted. Inside the court, staff described an unusual atmosphere. The justices, normally known for their professionalism and civility despite ideological differences, had quietly canceled their morning conference. Chief Justice Roberts requested private meetings with each justice instead of holding the usual group conference. By mid-morning, legal scholars across the country were publishing in-depth analyses. The Harvard Law Review rushed out a special digital edition examining the implications of Justice Kavanaugh's contradictions, while Yale Law School announced a symposium titled "Consistency in the Court, Before and After Appointment." Conservative legal groups worked quickly to defend Kavanaugh. The Federalist Society released a statement asserting that judicial philosophy naturally develops with experience and responsibility. Yet, even their response admitted that the specific inconsistencies surrounding voting rights were hard to explain without additional context. Around noon, an unexpected development emerged. 3 other justices issued a rare joint statement expressing concern about maintaining public confidence in the court's consistency. Without naming Kavanaugh directly, Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, and Barrett emphasized that changes in judicial philosophy should always be addressed openly and explained clearly. The Wall Street Journal editorial board described this as an unprecedented breach of court collegiality, while the Washington Post called it a necessary intervention to preserve institutional credibility. On Capitol Hill, the ripple effect continued. Senator Mitch McConnell, who had guided Kavanaugh's confirmation, avoided reporters' questions. Meanwhile, Senator Chuck Schumer introduced a new bill to strengthen Supreme Court ethics standards, including a rule requiring justices to explain significant shifts from their previously stated legal views. By afternoon, the story had moved far beyond Washington, becoming a cultural moment. Late-night comedy shows began crafting sketches about the exchange. Documentary filmmakers requested permission to use the footage. Even law school applications began to rise, with admissions essays referencing what some now called the Crockett effect. But perhaps the most meaningful change came outside the Capitol. In several state legislatures debating new voting restrictions, lawmakers paused deliberations. The contradictions Crockett had exposed made it far more difficult to justify these measures under Kavanaugh's own prior reasoning. In Georgia, a state senator who had once supported voting restrictions told reporters, "When you see someone's principles change so drastically after gaining power, it makes you question your own beliefs." Professional legal organizations soon joined the discussion. The American Bar Association announced a special commission on consistency in legal reasoning. Law schools reported that applications for civil rights clinics had doubled overnight. Meanwhile, social media platforms struggled to keep up. The hashtag #TogshareWhich had been used over 15 million times. Across the country, ordinary Americans shared personal experiences with voting barriers alongside the viral clip. What began as a technical legal exchange had evolved into a national conversation about consistency, power, and rights. By evening, the White House released a carefully worded statement. The president said, "When our highest court issues decisions affecting fundamental rights, Americans deserve confidence that those rulings rest on consistent legal principles, not shifting political winds, constitutional." Experts noted that this was the most direct presidential comment on Supreme Court reasoning in decades, while still avoiding any challenge to the court's independence. As night fell, a new phase emerged. Citizens began organizing consistency rallies across the country. These weren't typical partisan protests, but gatherings united by a single demand: that public officials explain major shifts in their stated beliefs. In Texas, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's home state, thousands assembled outside the state capitol. The crowd included both conservatives and progressives, joined together in calling for greater consistency from elected leaders and judges alike. A week after the hearing, the most unexpected development occurred. Justice Brett Kavanaugh requested a rare opportunity to issue a supplemental explanation for his voting rights decision. In a 15-page document, he acknowledged the contradictions Crockett had identified and detailed how his thinking had evolved. While defending his ruling, he admitted he should have directly addressed his earlier positions rather than appearing to ignore them. Legal experts called this historic, the first time in modern court history that a justice had issued such clarification in response to public criticism. Crockett later broke her silence with a brief, thoughtful statement. Justice Kavanaugh's willingness to explain his evolution shows respect for the American people. Transparency strengthens our institutions, even when we disagree with their outcomes. Her measured response elevated her reputation as a serious constitutional thinker, not just a partisan voice. 2 weeks later, polling revealed a striking shift. 67% of Americans, including majorities from both parties, said justices should explain major departures from previous legal positions. Law schools saw a 30% increase in applications to civil rights and constitutional law programs. Young people cited Crockett as proof that legal expertise could serve as a tool for accountability. A month later, the impact continued to spread. 3 state Supreme Courts, referencing the national debate on judicial consistency, began issuing unusually detailed explanations for rulings that departed from precedent. Senator Schumer's Supreme Court ethics bill gained bipartisan momentum, with several Republicans agreeing that transparency would strengthen public trust in the judiciary. Civil rights organizations reported record donations, with many contributors naming the Crockett-Kavanaugh exchange as their inspiration. Voter registration efforts surged, particularly among young citizens and communities long affected by voting restrictions. Most notably, other representatives began adopting Crockett's approach. Congressional hearings started shifting away from performative speeches toward genuine accountability sessions. Lawmakers from both sides arrived prepared, with prior statements, rulings, and evidence in hand. 6 months later, while walking through Dallas's Oak Cliff neighborhood where she began her legal career, Crockett was approached by a woman who said, "My daughter's starting law school because of you." She saw that clip and realized the law isn't just about words, it's about holding people to their principles. Crockett smiled. "Tell her to keep receipts." That simple exchange captured the essence of her impact. In just 30 seconds of precise questioning, Crockett proved that accountability doesn't require wealth, influence, or even much time, only preparation, accuracy, and the courage to ask a direct question. The story of Jasmine Crockett's questioning of Justice Kavanaugh transcended partisan lines, becoming a lasting lesson in democratic accountability. It reminded Americans that consistency matters, that principles should not change with power, and that sometimes the most effective challenge to authority is holding up a mirror to its contradictions. A year later, Crockett accepted the American Bar Association's Constitutional Courage Award. Reflecting on the moment, she said, "I didn't aim to create a viral moment. I simply believed that if Justice Kavanaugh's words mattered when he wrote them, they should matter when they became inconvenient. Consistency isn't partisan. It's the foundation of the rule of law." As the audience rose in a standing ovation, screens behind her replayed the moment that started it all, not with shouting or hostility, but with a single, piercing question that continues to echo through America's institutions. Which version should we believe? If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you in-depth coverage of the defining political moments shaping our democracy. Turn on notifications to never miss our latest uploads, and share this video to continue the conversation on judicial accountability. Your support helps us bring context behind the headlines.